Welcome back to another episode of Growth Marketers Podcast. I'm Samuel Timothy.
And I'm Taylor Rowe. Today we have a new installment in our series called Best in Class, where we explore key characteristics of best-in-class organizations and what makes them best in class. We're going to dive into sales departments today, and we're actually going to split that up into two parts. So today's episode, we dove into the components of a sales team, the components of a best-in-class sales playbook, and really what that looks like in terms of ramping up scaling. So recruiting, training, setting comp plans, those type of things. How do we incentivize those sales reps? So if you have questions around how to build your sales team or how to structure a sales team, what that should look like, what variables may impact that, that's what we're going to explore today. Please give us a like, subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening. Let's dive right into the episode.
So Taylor, we've been in this series called the Best in Class Companies. We've touched on a bunch of different things from a marketing perspective. We talked about the mindset of a business, leadership, especially in the marketing front, how they need to perceive marketing as an investment. We talked about a whole lot of things from a marketing standpoint, the technology, the leadership, the team structure, all of those things that goes into what makes a very best-in-class company and its marketing function. Today, we want to kind of shift our focus from marketing to sales and talk a little bit more specifically about what are some of the components that makes a best-in-class company's sales organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to look at some of those same components when it comes to sales, right? So let's start with the team structure. And I think it's important to understand that when you're trying to evaluate your sales team structure, you need to look at your actual sales process and what you're doing from a lead generation perspective and what your market looks like, what your customers are accustomed to in terms of a buying experience and a buyer's journey. And we need to make sure that we adapt, right? So if we learned anything from our best-in-class series on the marketing department, it's that we want to be cutting edge and leading the market when it comes to that overall buying experience, right? So one thing and one question that we get a lot of times, especially in the B2B world, is the overall structure of our sales team, specifically around the actual reps themselves, whether we see a lot of what we call SDR or BDR, sales development rep or business development rep, whose job is typically to prospect, cold call, cold email, go out and try to prospect, stir up opportunities, find people who might be a good fit, qualify them, and set meetings or set appointments for the account executive or sales executive. We saw a big shift probably 5 or 10 years ago in the B2B space when it comes to the actual sales team structure. And with prospecting and automation tools like Outreach and SalesLoft, they were all preaching this model of SDR, BDR, and AE, right? And so the whole idea and the methodology was that the more time that your sales reps spent prospecting, the less time that they would spend actually selling. And the more time they spent selling, they would focus on those opportunities and deals. And as soon as they cleared out their pipeline, they'd have to start all back over when it came to prospecting and filling the pipeline. So in order to have a consistent flow of leads, the model was you have an SDR, is all they do is set appointments, and then the AE is having those meetings and then trying to close those deals. And so there's no ebbs and flows to the marketing. There's no the sales. There's no roller coaster in terms of the pipeline and the actual deal volume on a monthly or quarterly basis, so we can have that consistency. I think that has shifted. That model has shifted a little bit, and I think we've seen trends in outbound maybe not being as straightforward as it used to be. I would say effective, but it can certainly still be effective. But I think you're just like with anything, you can't keep applying old strategies and methodologies to the way that people interact now, right? I think COVID, had a big impact on this because a lot of people are still working remote. You can't, just dial their the office phone anymore. No one has a direct line at their desk. And so you can't, even do, direct mail. We see a lot of companies do. So think you have to adapt from that perspective. And then the other side of it is, if we are a best-in-class organization, you look at what we talked about on the marketing side, we should be generating a high volume and percentage of our leads through inbound marketing, which means that we are actually educating our prospects at scale, and then we're getting more buyer-ready leads that are filling out, our form and a contact form. And we can't continue to apply the same methodology of, well, this is a new lead, so let me have a junior BDR jump on the phone and call and qualify this, director of marketing who is already so far along in the buyer's journey that it's going to frustrate them to try to get, qualification. Like, they may have very specific and poignant questions, and they may be ready to buy today. And we've seen a big trend in that as well. So I guess to summarize that, you want to look at your sales process, what you're selling, who you're selling to. Does it make sense for you to cold call them? Can you do that, cold call, cold email? Can you do that in a way that it needs to be personalized enough that you can dedicate resources to just do outbound? And if you can do that and it does make sense and it is setting appointments for AE, then I think that part of the equation makes sense to split up and divide and conquer, so to speak, so that you can have a consistent flow of leads. But as a best-in-class organization, you also should have a steady flow of inbound buyer-ready leads, which should ultimately be the goal, right? Because then you lower that cost of acquisition. In those scenarios, you should not have a qualifier, right, so to speak, calling them, and interrupting that inbound buying experience. You should align yourself in that sales process with where your buyers are. And typically what that means, if we go back to that same scenario of, a B2B tech company, some software company, they have all the videos, tools, features on your website. They have reviews. They maybe even had a trial, all these type of things. So they're pretty well aware of what your software can do for them, and they're looking for very specific questions. So calling and qualifying them could be kind of a turnoff in that sales process.
Yeah, I guess we should qualify by saying we've been talking about best-in-class companies. So these are companies who have a really strong inbound marketing methodology in place. They have consistent flow of inbound leads. They have, like you said, prospects that are much more educated in their buying process, and when they're coming in and inquiring about whatever the product or service, they're much more further down the sales process than that you would assume. And the biggest struggle that we have, right? Like, you put a very junior rep, that person does not have the real world experience of having talked to hundreds of other prospects or hundreds and thousands of conversations, and being able to uncover, right, very quickly, where is this customer in the buying journey, what are their pain points, and be able to lead them further along that sales process to get them to commitment. And when you put a junior rep, and you might have objections like, oh, they were not qualified, or they're not ready, or they were asking questions, whatever those questions might be, and then you might quickly disqualify. What ends up happening is, if you had a very senior and seasoned person in that seat, they'll be much more likely to sense where that buyer is and be able to kind of mirror that customer journey and respond back to them, or provide them with whatever the guidance that they need to move them further along. So you're doing a disservice to your organization by putting someone who's junior. And we're not saying don't give them opportunity to learn and get better every day, but you also need to understand that if you're investing into a very strong inbound marketing, you do want to have that customer experience to match what they learned from the website. And you don't want somebody who doesn't even know enough about what you have on the site to be the one that fielding those inbound calls or inquiries. You might just be wasting a lot of opportunities by doing that.
Right. Yeah. The role of the B2B salesperson is shifted and changed over the years, right? And, I would say today, marketing's job is to educate the prospect, and then the salesperson's job is to facilitate that sales process, right? So we talk a lot about, alignment, right? There's a lot of talk about marketing and sales alignment, but you really need to align yourself with your customers, because you need to align yourself with where they're at in their buyer's journey and how they're looking to make decisions. And if you try to force them into your funnel, then you fall back and revert back to the old ways of sales of, you're going to follow my sales funnel, right? Which in reality, again, the salesperson's role today is to really just understand what this person is trying to accomplish and what decisions they're trying to make what are those key decision making factors, and see if it's a good fit at the first point to buy your solution or work with the organization, and then from there help guide them and help them solve their challenges. Right, the reason they're trying to buy something from you is because they believe what you have could solve a challenge or solve a problem that they have, right? So you need to understand what that problem is, understand all the variables and nuances to that problem and how that may impact, and then help guide them and show them the features or parts of the solution that may be the most beneficial to them, right? And so as you mentioned, if you have a junior person in that, initial call, like the old saying is, there's only one shot at a first impression, right? So that can be a huge turnoff. We've seen a lot of companies, lose deals, lose opportunities because of misalignment at that stage of the buyer's journey, which as marketing, professionals, that can be very frustrating because we know how much work it can be to generate that buyer-ready lead. And if those opportunities are squandered because of a bad sales process or misalignment, or a junior rep just not having the experience, as you mentioned, to understand and read the situation, that can cause a huge divide within the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I can give countless examples of customers who've said, "Oh, we just need more leads. We just don't have enough qualified leads." But then if we just spot check, some sort of a win-loss analysis and spot check some of those leads that were generated, or if you look at the opportunities, a lot of it is, like you said, is just not having done a very good job of uncovering the pain and obviously moving that sales process much further along by having a lot of experience, having dealt with a lot of those sort of opportunities. So basically the concept we're trying to explain is kind of the divide and conquer model versus more of like a full cycle sales rep, right? So the divide and conquer is using an SDR or BDR to go uncover, proactively outreach to companies and get opportunities created, hand it over to an AE, versus more of a full cycle model where you have reps getting a lot of opportunities generated from marketing efforts, and then they're taking from initial interaction with the organization from a sales standpoint all the way down to the purchase. So that's sort of that model that we're thinking. So what are some criteria that they have to think about in terms of like, hey, which model should we pursue, and what are some of the other criteria that we should be looking at for
I think the first
sales team size?
I think the first one comes down to, as we said, the volume of inbound leads versus outbound leads. The more heavily focused your organization is on inbound leads, the more I would steer away from that divide and conquer model, right? I think, and I've seen a lot of organizations make this push, but actually bringing the SDR role underneath the marketing department, right? And so if you look at it that way, like the SDR is responsible for getting out and putting the word out, and that's what that prospecting role is, the cold emails, the cold calls, going to events or trade shows or anything like that, posting on social media. If you look at that as a marketing function, I think it changes your perspective and changes the metrics that you're going to track and measure. And then when you look at the sales role of that full cycle sales rep, their job is to, again, facilitate that sales process. So whenever an opportunity is created, it's only touched and only managed by that AE. That's what I would do if you're going to talk about dividing and conquering. I think the other factor, or one of the other main factors, is the size of the opportunities or size of the deals that you're working, right? So typically, as a rule of thumb, and this doesn't apply to every organization, right? But typically the higher annual contract value or the higher the deal size, the lower the volume, right? You typically don't get those two combined where it's we're facilitating 1 million deals a month for $1 million a piece, right? So the higher the opportunity size, again, typically means you need a more experienced rep. There's going to be more stakeholders involved. There's going to be more multiple touch points over maybe a longer period of time. Again, these are all just general rules of thumb here, but if that's the case, I would steer towards more of that full cycle rep to build that relationship over time. And again, it's going to take, there's more nuances in that type of a sales process. There's not a one point of the presentation. If you look at it that way, to say, well, this is where we won or lost the deal. It's a lot of small moments throughout that sales process that experienced account executive is going to win in the long run. If you're in a more high volume game, where again typically you're selling maybe a lower price point, that's where you need that consistency of outputs, where it may make sense to have an SDR or an SDR team that are setting appointments for those AEs. So probably depends on that average contract value. I don't know if I have a number in mind that makes sense in terms of that average contract value, but there's certainly a role for that and a time that it makes sense for a lot of companies. But that's one of the main factors I would look at is volume of inbound leads and then the size of your contracts.
Yeah, and I guess the other factor would be more of the size of the addressable market itself, right? So if you're in enterprise sales and you're going after the top 500 companies in the country, you're probably not going to have a lot of prospects to go after. So you don't need an army of people that are just sitting there prospecting and poking people, right? Whereas if you're in a more of a mid-market focused on the mid-market or SMB market, then you have a lot more volume of prospects to go after. Then in that sense, yes, you're going to probably need still some sort of a divide and conquer in some sense. But if you are, like you said, if the marketing function is driving more of that awareness and creating a lot of demand up front, and you are getting a lot more educated buyers coming in the door, then you may be better off just focused on really nice seasoned reps that can take the conversation from beginning to end.
Yeah.
So I guess you have to be asking yourself, what kind of a market are we playing in? And like you said, the deal size would get bigger and bigger, obviously, if you're going after the Fortune 500s, right? Like you're not going to be selling a couple $100 deals. So then that actually, almost makes perfect sense. Like you are going to have larger deals. The sales cycle is going to be a lot larger. You're going to have multiple stakeholders, and the decision making probably is much longer. All of those things would warrant that you want a less of a complicated team that actually is interacting with your customers. That you have a lot of flow of communication happening between team members within your organization and also on the prospect side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've seen again both ends of that spectrum, right? Where sometimes the addressable market is so niche and so small that marketing, a lot of marketing efforts don't even make sense, right? Like we've worked with consulted with some companies where it's like they are going after they're in a certain government contractor space, and there's only 15 facilities in the United States that can even purchase from them, right? And it's like that's not the same type of. There's only 15 companies. Like it doesn't really make sense to dump hundreds of thousands of dollars into marketing. Like there's 15 places, like just show up at their door, right? I mean, who the 15 people are, their address, the decision makers, you have their phone number. So there's your how the question is always like, what's the most effective and efficient way to get in front of our audience and to educate them? And if the addressable market is that small, it's a very different answer than 15 million or 15,000 or whatever the number is, right? So that's a great point of just understanding the addressable market and where you fit on that spectrum.
Yeah, and we talked about like the disrupting the buyer's buying process, the buyer journey. We've been on the enterprise software sales side where we work with other enterprise software companies who we partner with and to recommend and sell their solutions. And you've seen when the reps change because of quota difference or market basically like the territory changes and things like that. You see a rep change in the middle of an enterprise deal, and you lost all that continuity in that sales process, and there's so much information get lost, and the prospect gets really frustrated, right? So as much as possible, what you really want is that continuity of relationship with that whoever is that rep and the internal sales engineers who might be kind of supporting that salesperson, and all the way from the initial conversation all the way until that the signature is signed and the product is purchased and start to be adapted within the organization. So all of those things are telltale signs of what you want to be looking for and avoiding in an organization to make sure that your customers don't feel like they're just going through a horrible experience in buying your product or service.
Sure, absolutely. All right, and so just to kind of wrap up, our recommendations or our observations rather about best-in-class organizations from a team structure perspective, are there any other points that we would want to add? How do we define things like headcount or the types of roles and responsibilities that each of those organizations need to have within the sales team?
Yeah, we'll certainly get into more like how do you go about looking for headcount in when we talk about the recruiting side of it. But again, if you looked at everything that we recommended, it had nothing to do with the actual count of the reps. It's more about how do you approach the team structure that you would use to service your customer base, right? Like we're not talking about, hey, you better have 10 reps that are feeding, 10 SDR feeding 5 AEs with 2 meetings each on a per day basis or whatnot, right? We're not talking about any of those things. We're just looking at it. How do you market your business today? How do you generate your customers today? Are you going after more of a broader audience, or are you going after a very niche customer base? And if so, how many opportunities would you need to reach your revenue target? And then would it make sense for you to have more of a full cycle sales rep, or would you require more of a divide and conquer, and how much of it could be driven by marketing that speeds up the entire sales process overall? So that was kind of our overall thought behind kind of the team. How do you perceive the team of a best-in-class sales organization?
Sure. So let's move on to strategy then. So what observations have you seen from best-in-class organizations from a strategy perspective? What does that look like? What strategies are working? What strategies are not working? And really, how do you develop a strategy?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is they do have a go-to-market strategy, right? Like in terms of they're not just waking up every morning and just say, hey, who do we go after and what product are we selling? They have very defined go-to-market strategy, probably in collaborating with the marketing team that they built, right? And it contains a whole lot of things that goes into it. But essentially, it is a documented go-to-market strategy that empowers the sales team to go to tackle those accounts and win those deals. So I think that is the number one thing. What goes into a marketing strategy can vary based on a company, but at least they have some sort of a go-to-market strategy that is well defined for that organization. That's what we see as a common thing in a best-in-class organization.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, for people that are outside the sales world, you kind of assume that if someone's in sales, like their day is spent, pitching, right? You're just kind of always pitching ideas, right, and selling. But like I said, the role of the salesperson has changed. And, I don't look at it as selling. I think if you're selling, it's you're doing it the wrong way, right? You should be facilitating, you should be educating, you should be understanding, you should be asking questions, and you should be strategic. And so I think if what your day really looks like is, as you mentioned, you have a process that is repeatable. I think that's the first thing when you talk about strategy. If you look at what your best sales reps are, you shouldn't say, well, Sam is our most effective sales rep, but we don't know why, right? We can't replicate that into the next sales rep. So I think you need to have a strategy, as you mentioned, first and foremost. And then you need to look at things like account planning, right? What are these accounts that we're going after? How are we going to get into them? What is the strategy to, create those introductions, build value? Where is it going to be a fit? Who is a fit, right? What is our ideal customer profile? What is the positioning that we're going to take in our differentiation points? Understanding of the market, their competitors, who our customers are also looking at, and what's important to them, where they're at in their decision-making process or their organization that would lead them to work with a company like us, right? Like, what is that catalyst to change? It's more of a strategic thinker's role than a razzle dazzle pitch that you're going to see. So I think from a strategy perspective, as you mentioned, the first thing is have a strategy and then continuously fine tune and improve that. We talked about best in class organizations from a mindset perspective, and I think in our first episode of the series, that continuous improvement mindset needs to trickle down to every department in the organization, and certainly not different with the sales department.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen business guys that actually VP of sales and marketing. Like, how do you oversee two different distinct departments? Yes, there needs to be some sort of a collaboration happening between the two organizations, but it's not it's not a one operation, right? So if you're going to have a sales department that actually operating to meet the revenue goals and the company targets, then that department need to have its own documented plan on how they're going to go accomplish that, right? So if you have it, then if you're off the script or you're on script, right? If you're playing by the same rules that established and the same playbook, or if you're just going off script, right? So I think with what you just described, I think if you can educate your customers, if you can educate your internal reps on who's the right CP, what's their pain point, what are our differentiators, our value propositions, what do we bring to the table that our competitors do not have, and where are we weak, and being able to combat those weaknesses with whatever the positive might be. All of those things need to be documented and being presented to our reps and educating them about all of those things. Like you said, if you can do that, then that process is now repeatable, and then no two rep is going to be able to output the same amount of quality of sales opportunities and deals.
Yeah, and a couple points of clarification when it comes to the sales playbook, right? We want to be very detailed and think of every scenario when building the playbook, but you can't plan scripts, so to speak, for every scenario, right? So I think it's more important to have within that playbook, have a framework of how your organization handles sales in general. And I think a couple, examples that come to mind are things like, Sandler sales methodology or Challenger sales. If you have this framework and this mindset, right, then every opportunity that comes up, like, you already know how to handle it, because you look back to, well, how would you do this within the Sandler framework or something like that, right? So it's not so much as like, if a customer asks this question or this question or this question, you'll never be able to train up the next salesperson to understand that, because that leading sales rep that has the most experience and the most expertise is always going to be, so far ahead of them, right? So it's not, documenting every possible scenario, but it's building a framework for a process. Again, this is what our sales process should look like. Here's the general steps. It's not to say every client is going to go through that, but this is what we're trying to accomplish, because this is what we feel is best for our customer and inbound buying experience. These are the steps that need to happen in order for us to understand, properly assess, quote, and propose a solution to them. And then here's the framework of how we handle these conversations and move things along. Here's what our qualifying criteria looks like. So I would say when you're building a sales playbook, it should be strategic and it should be specific, but the specifics on the individual minute details need to be handled by an overarching framework.
Yeah, I'm glad that you highlighted that difference, because you can tell a rep that actually just, regurgitating what was written in their script, and it just sounds very robotic, right? And it's not it's not natural. And what you don't want is people are only able to just regurgitate it, not able to understand the circumstances behind that prospect's buying criterias and their decision-making, criterias and where they are in the buying journey, and being able to tailor the message to their specific need, right? So giving them a framework to operate out of, as opposed to like writing every sentence of how to structure every call. But you still should have, hey, what are some common questions we should ask in our discovery meeting? And what stage should you be by at this stage in the sales process, right? Yeah. What information should you have? Do you have the close date and the amount that they're willing to invest into it, the budget, and all of those things, right? Who are the decision makers? All of those things that you probably need to collect at a different stage of that sales conversation and process. Those things should be established, right? So when you're going into your CRM to assess the deal reviews, all of the things that you need to have, it's in there, right? And then it's pretty confident that the rep did a great job in uncovering the needs and identifying what are the buying criteria and who's involved in all of those things. But those things, you should probably have it very well documented and outlined. But I don't think you want to write for every possible scenario of emails and objections, which you're not giving room for creativity for the rep to operate out of.
Sure. So I think the natural transition from there is, okay, this is what our team structure should look like. We need a sales playbook in place. How do we ramp this up? How do we build the team? How do we hire, recruit, train, get our sales reps ready to hit the field?
Yeah, I think the common misconception is like, hey, if we just have more reps hired and every rep is going to just be attaining quota at very fast pace, and then we're just going to hit the revenue targets. If it was only that easy, then it would have been awesome, right? We've both been burned by hiring, making poor hiring decisions we've seen, right? And it's not about the time either, right? We've given very long ramp up time, and we've made a lot of mistakes on seeing how just hiring isn't the solution. So there's a lot that goes into to really identifying the candidates and recruiting.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I think there's probably a whole podcast there in terms of how much bad hire really costs you in terms of your sales organization and your company in general. But I think that goes back to that playbook, right? You need to be confident in your process and your strategy that we have sort of a mathematical equation, as you mentioned, that if we hire another rep and plug them into this playbook, it's going to result in an additional X number of dollars in revenue, right? And I think the old methodology, particularly in B2B, was like you just hire sales reps and give them no tools and resources, right? And they're just on their own, and that's where you got a lot of those the people that were successful. There was no repeatable process because it was just, well, they have all this network and Rolodex of connections, and they're bringing over a book of business from their old company. And it's not to say that doesn't still happen, but that's not a scalable solution. And I think what we're talking about today is best-in-class organizations that are looking to grow and scale, and those outliers, those one-off superstars that come in and don't need any resources, don't need any tools, don't need any tech, and can just bring over a book of business. Those are anomalies, right? So that's not a way to build the business. Is let's just win the lottery every time, right? We need an actual strategy in place, and the same thing goes with your recruiting and ramp up. Like, you need to find people that fit your culture, fit your system, that you believe can be plug and play with the process that you have in place, and of course people that can think outside the box and help you improve that process.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you, like you said, if you have that sales playbook established, then you can see if a rep is following this playbook, what's an average rep's output could be on a per quarter basis or annual basis, right? And you can use that as a baseline and say, well, what is our revenue target? How many reps of this caliber do we need to have to reach that revenue goal? And what is the reasonable time it takes them to get to ramp up and to reach kind of the average revenue goals per quarter or per month? And then how many of those reps would need to be in place to continue to scale up, right? And then number of people we would have to have in the pipeline to hire, train, right? How long it takes them to get to that quota carrying level. So there's got to be some sort of a planning in place, but it isn't just, like you said, hiring the best guy out of. I mean, I've heard stories of, I think it was actually HubSpot's chief revenue officer, Mark Reverse, shared a story. I think at the early days of HubSpot, they tried to hire a really seasoned enterprise salesperson. I think it was from like IBM or somewhere like that. So they thought, oh, this is going to help HubSpot get into mega accounts and things like that. But then what they found out was that person was succeeding because they were at an organization that had a very strong brand presence and had massive amount of leads. They were killing their quotas because they actually were in an organization that had it all. But whereas putting them into an organization that was in a hyper growth stage and they didn't have that market presence or brand presence, bringing somebody who didn't have that sort of experience working in a startup world couldn't evolve fast enough, and they couldn't iterate fast enough, and they couldn't reinvent themselves fast enough. So that person failed. So it has nothing to do with the fact that the person didn't have any experience or didn't come from a very enterprise sales experience, but they just were in the right culture fit or had the success success metrics needed to get there. So all of those things do matter, right? Like, you do want to have people with good caliber and good experience, but that doesn't always guarantee that you're just going to have it, right? So knowing all of the things that we just discussed, like what it takes to really get to attaining quota, and then how many of those reps would you need to have in the pipeline to kind of reach your revenue goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, speaking of attaining quota and those type of things, I think the final piece of when we talk about hiring a sales team, the structure, and ramping them up, is having, especially if you're early on in the process of building your team, is having a very clear comp plan that is both clear and attainable, but also incentivizes your salespeople, right? And so, I mean, we've seen both ends of the spectrum, right? Where sales reps aren't compensated on commission, and we've seen sales reps that are only compensated on commission, right? And you have to ask yourself, right, if we're going to build a best-in-class organization, that means we need best-in-class people. We need A players. Best salespeople are selling, right? So they're hitting quota, they're selling, they're making money at their current organization typically. And so how do we entice them to come over to our organization? Well, typically it's income based, right? It's compensation drives motivation, right? So we need to have a clear cut path and solution that they can make more money at our organization, and a detailed plan of how that happens. And it helps when there's other people doing it, right? When you have a sales team, when you have other players that are, earning a certain amount of money, and you can show them that path. Hey, this is how you can do that. This is how you can do this for you and your family. Follow this process, right? Follow this framework. And that's really what, when we talk about building a repeatable process, it's all going to come down to revenue for the company and income for the rep.
Yeah, I mean, just increasing the quota doesn't necessarily mean that the reps can actually attain it, right? A lot of times we've seen
see that a lot.
Reps
yeah.
get desperate because oh shoot, my quota just increased. Now I got to work really hard, and then they get on a prospect call and they're just trying to close.
And it changes the right. It really changes the dynamic in the mindset. I mean, really and you go back to, depending on what methodology you want to follow, but kind of the inbound buying process. If you position yourself as a facilitator, you're looking for the right fit. You're in the B2B. You're taking maybe a more Sandler approach to sales. You need to disconnect yourself with from the outcome of that sale, right? And so the best case scenario would be a sales rep that has a mindset that his commission is fully guaranteed, right? I don't care essentially if you buy this or not. I'm just trying to help. That would be the right mindset, with the obviously real objective of them getting paid on that commission because they're obviously incentivized. But as you mentioned, there's a breaking point where if you just raise the commission with no increase in lead volume or ways to get, there's no clear path to get to that quota, and you say, hey, you just have to sell more with the same resources, the same leads, in the same amount of time, right? I mean, we're not adding time to the months. So the quota is increasing, the leads are staying the same or decreasing, and because of external pressure, the pressure is then placed all the way down to that rep, and sometimes that pressure becomes very obvious in that sales process, and it can ruin the whole deal. So sometimes actually increasing that quota actually lowers salespeople's productivity, and we've seen that a lot. Kind of getting that you can smell the commission breath, right? You can tell that they're desperate for that deal, and you can feel the desperation, and that's not a good experience for anybody involved.
Yeah, I mean, prospects can smell it, so be very careful as an organization. Like you said, if you have a playbook and you already know what is realistically attainable, then stick with that and just don't change quota because your revenue targets set by the leadership just went up by 20%. Now you're trying to spread that across your sales organization and say, hey, let's go figure out how you're going to reach the revenue goals.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more to come in the best-in-class sales organizations. A lot more we'll be covering in the upcoming episode. In the interest of time, we're going to wrap here, but hopefully you've been enjoying this series of episodes we've been having about the best-in-class companies. So continue to stay tuned.
Growth Marketers is brought to you by One IMS, helping you reach new heights through integrated marketing. One world, one web, one IMS.